like to introduce you to Steve, who I've known for quite a few years now. I think the last time we just spoke was embarrassingly around 5 years ago during the Gallipoli Association conference we had in Birmingham. So for the centenary years or thereabouts. Steve, he says, blames his interest on World War One, not dissimilar to me on a box of Airfix World War One soldiers. Yeah, I think I won't say how many years ago that was, but it's something to make a change from those damp seaside British holidays, in Steve's words. Steve has a degree in history and 25 years as a teacher, and really had great interest in World War One, First World War from early years, which has been reignited by access to the diaries and letters and wartime photographs of Lucas, who is his wife's grandfather. We'll be hearing about a little bit later on tonight. He's a long-standing member of the Gallipoli Association and Western Front Association, and speaking at many conferences and branch meetings around the UK. He's now a civil servant, reveling in an very excited to have an employee number that finishes in 007. I'm not sure what his employee is, and if he is that special agent, we shouldn't be mentioning. But I am really waiting for that next 007 movie, which will hopefully be out this year in the cinemas. He's particularly pleased to have recently passed several auditions for the TV show Pointless. I think we can say no more on that one. So before I go any more into his history, love to welcome Steve Warburton and his talk tonight on the Incomparable Loss, an analysis of the impact of the Dardanelles campaign on the leadership of the 29th Division. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks very much, Steve, for your introduction. And I would very much like to take this opportunity to thank Ian, Steve and the Gallipoli Association for inviting me to give this talk. Since my first tentative connections with the association, I've been grateful to those such as Ian, Steve, and Keith and Lynn Edmonds, who've encouraged me to get involved and contribute. And that's the spirit in which I share with you tonight. I don't make any claim at all to be an expert. Indeed, there are probably many watching who will, I think, have forgotten more than I will ever learn about this campaign. But I've tried to draw together many strings of study to look at this theme. The theme, an incomparable loss, the impact of the Dardanelles campaign on the leadership of the 29th Division. I came up with this title. I thought it was a brilliant title, but then I feel a little bit like the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force now. I feel like I've bitten off far more than I can chew, but here goes. So why the 29th Division? Well, like many of us, it's the personal connection. My wife's grandfather, CHT Lucas, fought in the campaign. But it's more than that. He wrote a daily personal diary throughout his time on active service in the First World War. He sent letters home weekly, and he managed to take a few photographs and get copies of others from his contemporaries. Among these treasures which remain, because unfortunately his medals were sold by my father-in-law, his son, to purchase double glazing for his retirement bungalow, were two copies of the story of the 29th Division, one of which was annotated by his own now familiar hand after I've transcribed over 100,000 words of his diaries. This litany of gallant deeds engaged me, and so did a couple of other pieces of evidence. One was a small handbook listing the 29th Division leadership, And another was a phone call from my family history loving sister-in-law asking why her grandfather was named on a memorial on a roundabout somewhere in the middle of England. And so my journey started. The 29th Division was formed, a less charitable observer might say thrown together, at the end of 1914 and the beginning of 1915. A combination of regular army battalions with the supporting arms drawn from territorial forces was mustered into 3 semi-coherent brigades. The 86th Fusiliers, 1st Lancashire Fusiliers, the Dublin Fusiliers, the Royal Munster Fusiliers, and the 2nd Royal Fusiliers. What was known as the Union Brigade, the 87th, with the Border Regiment, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, the South Wales Borderers, and the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, and the County Brigade. Now, I've called that the Cricketing Counties Brigade, as it was initially supposed to include the Middlesex Regiment joining those battalions from Worcestershire, Essex, and Hampshire. Unfortunately, as the BEF hemorrhaged men in the autumn of 1914, the Middlesex Regiment were purloined elsewhere, and consequently the 1st, 5th Royal Scots were added to that county brigade. Lucas himself came from a Western Front, but the battalions of the 29th Division were drawn from across the empire. In fact, the majority of them were in Asia, India, Burma, and Mauritius. It was just, of course, the Royal Scots who came from far more familiar and nearby climes. Lucas recounts his feelings of being marooned without the necessary paraphernalia, support, or experience. He said on January the 7th in his diary, reported at the War Office, find I am 87th and not 88th Brigade. A decision which would, of course, be very significant for his family in later years. If he'd been Brigade Major for the 88th, who knows if I'd be here talking to you now. And then on the 9th, he caught the 3 p.m. to Salisbury, arrived at 5:40. He had a bundle of papers thrown into his hands, told to proceed at once to Rugby and make preparations for the brigade. No clerk, no stationery, no regulations, no cash, and no general at present. Most of the billeting has been done by the local authorities, and he says he has no experience of this sort of work. His protestations actually do ring slightly hollow. He was one of the 2nd-year staff college students who at the beginning of the war had been upgraded to PSC, Past Staff College. He did have 16 years service as an officer, and as part of that had managed the development of Port Sudan whilst on secondment to the colonial service. During his leisure time whilst in Sudan, he'd managed to shoot off 2 fingers of one of his hands in a shooting accident. He was quite an adventurer. Indeed, I conducted some of my courtship with his granddaughter sitting underneath the ear of an elephant that he had shot during one of his colonial expeditions. So now, whilst the rifle battalions were coherent regular units on their regimental rotation overseas, brigade and division headquarters were created in a fairly frantic few weeks. Now, the leadership of the brigades at that time was fairly typical of the time frame. So typical in terms of the sort of families that the colonels and leaders of the battalions came from, typical in terms of the length of service that they'd had with the colours, usually over 20 years, typical in the sort of school that they'd come from. Most of them were married. Lucas was still single at that time, but they were a fairly homogeneous group. That homogeneity and the characteristics of the class that they come from has been criticised by some commentators, people like Tim Travers. But in some ways, these men were products of their time. The division was to be led by General F.C. Shaw, who was recovering from wounds sustained during the BEF struggles in northern France and Belgium from August to December 1914. But Shaw would be the first casualty, as he was replaced just prior to sailing by another general with recent brigade leadership experience on the Western Front, that slashing man of action, Alma Hunter Weston. There were high hopes for this division. Its first joint exercise, and therein lies a problem in itself, as an almost complete division, was in March 1915, when it was inspected by the King. The last of the regular divisions to join the fight, it had just found out that it was to embark for the Dardanelles within a week. There was high praise for the division from General Hunter Weston himself. The men are certainly very fine. The officers are up to the highest peace standard and up to full strength. He has a comment that maybe some of the lieutenant colonels are a bit old, and the fact that it's not trained together means it's not a well-oiled machine. The brigade major of the artillery component of the division says this is a very fine division, the best we now have, I think. The artillery is a good show. So such positive statements. The King himself sent a message to the division after he'd inspected them. I was much struck with the steadiness of this splendid body of men composing the 29th Division, and the combination of so many experienced officers and seasoned soldiers whom I noticed on parade. I feel confident of their inestimable value on the field of battle, and that the 29th Division, wherever employed, will uphold the high reputation already won by my armies, both in France and Belgium, and you may rest assured that your movements and welfare will ever be in my mind. George Rex. Others have slightly different comments. Professor Gary Sheffield comments that the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force had to make do with what was left over, saying it was not until the latter stages of the campaign that good quality commanders with Western Front experience were sent to the Dardanelles, a case of too little, too late. I'm not sure if that's entirely fair comment by Gary, and when I get to see him next time, perhaps I'll have a chat about it, because those officers leading the brigade, some of them did have Western Front experience very recently. The brigade majors themselves had been drawn from the Western Front. Indeed, the 2nd South Wales Borderers had actually been involved in conflict already in China. So perhaps it is a little bit rough to say that there wasn't Western Front experience. It would have actually been very difficult for the battalion commanders to have had that experience, because they had been exactly in the rest of the empire, India, Mauritius, Burma, China, as we've seen. The leadership of the 29th Division splits opinions, and this man himself does his utmost to split those opinions. So Lucas said, "We are very sorry that Hunter Weston has been given this division and Shaw taken away at the last minute. Hunter Weston is a pal of Kay's," that's Kitchener. "It's a dirty trick to play on Shaw. We had to go over and dine with Hunter Weston at Leamington last night so that he should meet us all." Lucas's comments there in mid-March, wondering what was going on for such a change to happen so close to embarkation. On the 17th of July, Hunter Weston, commanding the 8th Corps, left the peninsula for a few days' rest. And it is actually to his commanding officer, Sir Ian Hamilton's very deep regret that he was subsequently invalided home. Hamilton had already drawn attention to Hunter Weston's self-confidence, his energy and ability in dispatches home and messages back to the War Cabinet. And I've left some space in between those statements because it's not my job tonight to try and sum up Elmer Hunter Weston. He does divide opinion. And although there is some revision of his reputation going on, I think we can still say that he still does divide that opinion. I want to go back to a slide which we had just a while ago, which I didn't comment on at the time, just flipped past, sorry about that. And this is a slide which shows the officer wastage. That's I think horrible. It's a very accurate word, but in some ways horrible at the same time. For the division, April 1915 to January 1916, when it left the peninsula. So if we look at that, we can see that within these 9 months, its officer casualties would exceed its strength at marching past the King by about a factor of 3. The majority of missing officers there would end up actually swelling the ranks of the dead in the end. But you can just see those numbers. Over 500 wounded, nearly 100 missing, 450 officers evacuated sick, so left the peninsula sick, and then approximately 220 officers killed in the division. I think the division actually had some advantages as it left for the Mediterranean. One advantage is it wasn't the 28th Division. It's a bit of a bad joke against the 28th Division, who came to be a formation that was not highly regarded at all for a considerable part of the hostilities by their contemporaries. The 29th was actually led by leaders with considerable combat experience, whether like Hunter Weston, Marshall, Franklin, Coster-Kern, Lucas, in charge of brigades, battalions and companies on the Western Front, or the extensive experience, often over 25 years, of the battalion senior officers covering the Boer Wars and multiple colonial expeditions. The rifle battalions had only recently reorganized from 8 companies into 4. This means that nearly half the officers in a battalion might have had company leadership experience. Invaluable, as these formations suffered 50% casualties in the early exchanges on the peninsula. The vast majority of the rifle battalions had settled command groups, colonels and majors, often with a decade or more of experience working together. And whilst the climate and landscape features on the Gallipoli Peninsula were a considerable hurdle to military endeavours, these men did at least have the experience of living in hot, harsh, and inhospitable climes. This last of the regular divisions also benefited from brigade majors that had recently been passed out of Staff College. And though they might have only done 3/4 of the course, these men were still trained staff officers whose organisational powers were deemed crucial for effective formation operations. I thought I'd include the amphibious assault training. They had at least practiced getting into and out of boats. And this is where they were going. The Dardanelles, the Gallipoli Peninsula. They're on a mission. It was a mission which their divisional commander, Hunter Weston, spent most of the voyage to the Mediterranean formulating his objections to, and actually presented a paper to Hamilton, and also tried to influence the decision of the War Cabinet about the future of the expedition. I think we could say that, let's try and sum up the mission. For the Navy to get through the straits, the Army had to capture forts whose guns covered the narrow waterway. Pure, but not to prove at all simple. For many of us who know about Gallipoli, looking at the landings, we know so much. And I apologise now for what will seem a very quick skate over of some of the things that happened. But what I'm trying to do is just look at them from the perspective of the impact on the leadership groups, as the 29th Division was split between those 5 beaches, S, V, W, X, and Y. I was going to try and do the whole talk without referring to the Australians. But at this point, I will apologise to the Australians and the Anzacs for the fact that they're hardly going to get a mention tonight. But we are going to do a good bit of focus on the 29th Division, who I don't think get enough credit themselves for their contribution to this campaign. So on the first morning of the landing, which would eventually occupy these areas, on the first morning of the landing, of the brigade level officers commanding, whilst Marshal of the 87th was wounded in the leg, but stayed in the fight. Hare of the 86th, General Hare, commanding the covering force, was wounded and ended up having to be evacuated from W Beach. Napier of the 88th died attempting to energise the attack from the SS River Clyde at V Beach. There are different opinions on how he died and when he died, but undoubtedly it was in a bid to inspire his men to overcome the withering fire from the Ottoman defenders. And he was rapidly shot down. Kostika, his brigade major, died alongside his superior. Brigade Major Frankland on W Beach took over direction of the fight from Hare, but his personal bravery resulted in his own death soon after. After Napier was killed at V Beach, Carrington Smith, Colonel commanding the 2nd Hampshires, took command of the assault until he was shot and killed on the bridge of the River Clyde a few minutes later. Command then passed to Tizard of the 1st Royal Munster Fusiliers. Ruth of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers had already been killed in one of the first boats to ground on the beach at V. From the other rifle battalions, at W Beach, Ormond of the Lancashire Fusiliers had not even got into a boat because he had been diagnosed with a significant medical problem. Newenham of the Royal Fusiliers was severely wounded, I believe later losing a leg as a result of that wound. Now, whilst the light opposition at X Beach and S was initially quickly quelled, on Y Beach, Colonel Coe of the King's Own Scottish Borderers was killed as the force there was pushed back to and initially held a line above the cliffs. The familiar scene from V, a drawing of the attack on W, and a slightly more, shall we say, overdrawn, overpainted version of that same landing of the Lancashires on W Beach. At W, what we have is a situation where perhaps we see the significance of leadership and also the impact of the absence of leadership all at the same time. This is the reminiscences of Harold Miners Farmer, staff captain of the 86th Brigade, himself a member of the Lancashire Fusiliers, who found himself effectively commanding that attack on W Beach in the first few hours of the 25th of April. He couldn't get hold of other senior officers. The Fusiliers had lost all theirs. Other battalions were cut off. He did his best to send messages and instructions as if the general was still on the spot. And what he says about the general is the general and his brigade major were the power that gave cohesion to the operation. And at a moment when the troops were enduring the effects of a bewildering shock, that was the opposition they received on initial landing, they gave them a plan to pursue with confidence. The general and Frankland had the energy and enthusiasm of boys and the coolest bravery and skills. It was, he says, contagious. Life was a little bit different elsewhere. The landing of the 87th Brigade headquarters differs from some others, it says, in the story of the 29th Division. Lucas' comments are highlighted there. He says he recollects a bright sunny morning, dead calm sea, not a shot fired. He had a bag in one hand, a coat over his arm, and was assisted down the plank from the boat by an obliging sailor so that he should not wet his boots. The only thing missing was the hotel. I sometimes wonder if this was, a tone deaf comment by Lucas, a comment in some ways which seeks to downplay what happened elsewhere, but it is actually a comment typical of the man, a very phlegmatic, pragmatic, professional soldier. I did a little bit of analysis of the officer deaths in the 87th Brigade, and I hope you can work with this graphic as it goes. In the week beginning, or a few days of the landing, what we have is losses across the 87th, and these are officer deaths. Not surprisingly, the majority are lost from the Borders and the King's Own Scottish Borderers, the Borderers who suffered so much at Y Beach, losing Coe, but also the Borders to whom fell the task of protecting X Beach on the first night, the night of the 25th into 26th of April. There's a question which always stands about Y Beach and whether it was an incomparable opportunity that was lost. We could talk all night about the issues caused by who was actually in command at that beach. Was it Matthews of the Royal Naval Division, or was it Coe of the King's Own Scottish Borderers. We can talk about why was there no advance south or across the peninsula. We can ask why was the landing not reinforced, and many of us will know lots of the elements that are the answers to this question. And we can ask why was there a lack of communication with Y Beach, whether it be from X Beach or whether it be from the ships and the command structures that were out to sea. What we do know is that Colonel Coe was lost. He was to be one of 7 different battalion commanders for the King's Own Scottish Borderers during the campaign. And who knows what would have happened if things had gone differently at Y Beach. The next day, there were still more losses of redoubtable leaders. Charles Doughty Wiley leading the charge into Sed el Bahr, into the village and the fort, alongside Captain Walford, the brigade major of the 29th Division's artillery. Lost as they led the battered remnants of the 86th and 8th Brigade up the village. And there you can see on the left-hand side their graves that were marked at that spot, and still are, I believe, Doughty Wiley's grave is there. I've never visited the peninsula. I always feel it's I'm not doing my my grandfather-in-law right until I go. So who knows, perhaps I'll see some of you on the Gallipoli Association tour sometime. If we look at how those officer deaths continue, we can see that it is still the King's Own Scottish Borderers and the Borders who, from the landing up to the Third Battle of Krithia, lost a far more significant percentage of their officers. And this is the way that that was allocated in those weeks. Now, those of you who can count, and that's all of you, but also who know something about the rough size of an officer group of an infantry battalion will realise that the numbers there of the King's Own Scottish Borderers who died indicate more or less an entire loss of strength. The reason for that is that by the beginning of June, a draft had arrived for the battered battalions, and as we can see from those who died at that time, many of them had been brought into that draft from other regiments, lieutenants and captains who were then to die in the battles of early June. Some of Lucas's snapshots tell us a story about this time as well. This is a snap taken above X Beach, April the 26th. If we look again at these gentlemen and what happened to them, Colonel Frank Jones, Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, lost at the beginning of May, severely wounded and then taken on board ship. They didn't initially think his wound was serious, but he had an internal injury that wasn't initially diagnosed and died on board hospital ship. His successor, Major Somerville, commanded the battalion for 4 days before he too was wounded and evacuated. Hammond Smith, later in the campaign, to be wounded, had to leave the peninsula. General Marshall there, wounded on day 1, wounded in the leg, but stayed and fought on. And finally, Phillips, the signal officer of the battalion, who by September 1915 needed to be evacuated. The brigade leadership had tried to make sure that he got a chance for a rest period, but in the end, he didn't get that rest. He collapsed from exhaustion and the effects of sickness and also wound, and so was eventually sent off back to England to recover. Another snapshot. One which is sad, taken on board ship as they progressed through the Mediterranean to Alexandria. One of Coe, McAllister and Welsh of the King's Own Scottish Borderers. And this is a letter from Lucas home to his mother saying, can you send copies to their wives? And he added their addresses to make that possible. To ensure the 88th Brigade gets a little bit of love, I've constructed this graphic which tries to show sort of a time lag. Now, imagine 4 seconds lasts a week. So what you will see is the graphic showing wounds and those who died over this period of time. So this is the 4th Worcestershires. It's information that's drawn from the regimental history, the Great War Forum thread, and also Rob Walker's wonderful book, To What End Did They Die? So 4 seconds is a week. So you can see the size of the losses, the wounds inflicted on this battalion, including its colonel, Cayley. Cayley, who later became General Officer commanding the 29th Division towards the end of the war, and was the instigator for the story of the 29th Division. He asked for a record of its gallant deeds. So most of these losses were in the early weeks, but the losses continued through the campaign, through into August and into September. Entwistle, we know, was captured after being wounded, and also James managed 2 wound stripes and also to win the VC. So that's the 4th Worcestershires. At this point, it seems appropriate to go back to some of my inspiration for looking at the 29th. The directories that Lucas had in his possession, where he records some of the impact in terms of what happened to his peers at this time. So the 86th, some of the 87th there. And even then, he didn't get all the information. There was even a spelling mistake in the directory. And we have Coe killed because he had come back off sick leave to take command of the Borderers in March 1915. See there the mention of the Middlesex Regiment, which was in France and did not join the division. The 29th had 3 full-time generals during the year from its creation to the end of its first year. Shaw, Hunter Weston and Delisle. 3 very different men and different in their styles of operation. Shaw's meticulous preparation included a handbook for his division. If we leave aside Hunter Weston's more colourful epithets and instead focus on the slashing man of action, then what a contrast to Shaw's calm efficiency, which he was to demonstrate later when he led the 39th Division in the latter part of the year. Farmer doesn't seem to be very keen on Delisle, whilst Lucas complains about his fussy approach to divisional command. Actually, one comment he makes is that stone latrine seats are not a good idea. The comment came from Delisle, but Lucas just couldn't quite believe that this is what they were going to pay attention to in September 1915. He had a propensity also for showing himself in his red braid and attracting fire from Turkish gunners and snipers on the headquarters of the brigades. I'll hope you'll spare me a few moments to talk through Lucas's perspectives on command issues in the campaign. When I first read the diaries, I kept turning the page, hoping for some expose, a smoking gun, a morsel of new evidence, and even a degree of emotional flowing prose. But it was not to be. There is no fortune for me to be made in a book of Lucas's diaries. His words, however, do serve to reinforce the words and insights of others. In April, just an awareness of the effect of the first few days, there are very few unwanted officers left in the brigade. The brigadiers they've lost, the brigade majors killed, and he suspects at least half of the surviving regimental officers by the end of April 28th. He himself says he's had very little personal excitement, except for rifle and shell fire. Classic Lucas downplaying the situation. Later on, he goes to highlight perhaps something that he didn't really want to talk about, and that's the differences of opinion with Hunter Weston. May the 6th, he's saying, what we want for is a practical general for the division instead of a theoretical one. Someone who actually realizes the realities of the situation. May the 8th. All was going quietly and well until at 5 p.m. we received an order from division that the whole line was to advance at 5:30. It was a damnable evening. No thought being given as to how the attack was to be brought about and the condition of the troops, no time allowed for preparation, and the whole thing was criminal. Again, a confrontation with Hunter Weston on May the 26th, and another one again on May the 27th. Disputes about how advances were going to be managed, how Hunter Weston could be confronted, and perhaps suggested that that wasn't a good idea. By June the 27th, Lucas is already beginning to note the effect on those officers who had survived. Colonel Casson of the South Wales border, as he says, has been very seedy lately. Things not right with officers. Again, what we've got is in conferences of COs. He says, it's remarkable how the plans grow. And again, blames Hunter Weston, saying he must be at the bottom of it. His plans grow daily and tend to upset arrangements without giving time to make alterations. Then what we get is a classic bit of Lucas moaning about colonels brought over from Britain to take command of the battered battalions. Colonels Agnew and Ward are mentioned. And what Lucas tries to say is that those who have won the respect of their men, who are part of that regimental esprit de corps, deserve the chance to carry on leading their battalions. They were doing such a great job. Like Stoney, he's kept the battalion together the whole time when practically everyone else was killed or wounded. You could not find a better man to command a battalion. Within Lucas's papers, there are also the occasional comment. Now this one, you can see that it's captioned "Naval Support in the Dardanelles." Of course, there is no naval support pictured in the photograph. And it's just Lucas making his point that despite the promise of naval gunfire support, it just was not practical to support the forces as they tried to move inland on the peninsula because of the lie of the land, because of the problems with ships' guns not being designed to fire like howitzers high up in the air and then come back down again. Farmer had his own perspectives. He wrote about all the different brigadiers he served with in his 70-odd days on the peninsula. Doran gets the most criticism. He'd come tired from France. Remember, Sheffield earlier said that Western Front leadership experience eventually came. Well, Doran, who had that, came tired from France and broke down from inability to sleep soon after he'd lost his staff captain. He also talks about the effects of dysentery and mental collapse affecting Boyle and Williams, his close colleagues. But a comment there, I am very sorry for the brigadier, but every soul but the hardiest are the worst for being overdone in the 29th Division. It's no one's fault because they're the only regular division and they have to be used all the time. Long goes in the trenches, 18 days, 10 days, 3 for rest, but they're not really much rest at all. And finally, the battalions are almost unrecognisable. The peninsula was to wreck people in body and in spirit. Muir writes in his book, This Bloody Place, with the incomparable 29th, about the end of his 43 days on the peninsula. He eventually says, I was all in, collapsed into a sort of maudlin, weeping condition. I must have a rest. I've been under fire, but eventually it was recognised he could not continue. He could not continue. And it takes months for him to recover to anywhere near where he feels he could face the fight again. I would like to recommend to you Catherine Swinfen-Eady's book, Cornerstones, about the life of Harold Miners Farmore. It is an exceptionally good book, and its section on Gallipoli, I think, conveys the trauma that these men went through trying to direct what was essentially an impossible task that they were facing. For her, she says, the legacy of the Dardanelles campaign is lined with tragedy, blame and questions. Its personal cost on miners was great, both in the loss of dear and close friends, but also on his health. Just one small quote here. He arrived back from Gallipoli a shadow of his former self. The blow to his head would continue to plague him throughout the war. He had problems with any form of vibration, noise and tremor, all things that war zones have a habit at throwing at you. He insisted on serving, but he was aware of his limitations physically. It is also clear from his papers that the campaign left a lasting impression on him. I won't read this out from Lucas, but if you get the chance to read his diary, which is available online, you will find a man who deals with close disaster with the most tongue-in-cheek comment. He gets very upset about nearly getting blown up by a shell coming through the roof of the small farm they'd taken over. I think it might have been Pink Farm, I'm not sure. He's particularly annoyed about the fact that his air cushion and his camera have been completely destroyed, along with his fleece-lined sleeping bag and his waterproof sheet. If you remember that image of the officers at X Beach on April 26th, they look a rather more, I don't know how we can say, well, they look a rather more sort of a dogged bunch of individuals there. So we've got Petrie, Marshall, and Lucas on the right, and Phillips in the front, as they perhaps emerge after 18 days, as Lucas said, with no chance for a shave, no chance to change clothes, at the beginning of May 1915. And they lost friends, they lost colleagues. These are the graves of Morrow and Antrobus of King's Own Scottish Borderers, I believe. Graves from Lancashire Landing. And by August 15, the leadership of the brigade had changed entirely. Majors or captains were leading the battalions, and Lucas had temporarily taken over the brigade several times during July and August as Marshall got redeployed as a divisional troubleshooter across the peninsula. I don't want to talk in depth about what happened at Suvla for the 29th Division. They were supposed to be Dardanelles' solution, the silver bullet to the problem of driving the forces off the salt plains and into the low hills surrounding, moving on the 21st of August from Chocolate Hill and taking Scimitar Hill. We all know what happened on those days and the calamitous impact on the division, the 29th, and its brigades that were in operation that day. It was not the place where the 29th wanted to be, but they were called and they answered to the challenge that they were given. The 88th Brigade apparently only just arrived on the beach less than 24 hours before they were due into the attack. The attack was directed from Chocolate Hill. This is the HQ dugout, so close to the fighting that there were even signallers wounded during the battle. And we can see again the significant number of deaths, wounded, killed, and missing of officers involved on that day. And the missing were mostly killed and wounded out in front of the trenches and couldn't be found initially. Some personal comments. There was a profound sense of loss for Lucas, for his colleagues. He expresses it. It breaks through in different ways. It broke through here, where he talks about the eventual gain on the 21st of August being practically nil at an expensive price. It gets personal on October the 15th when he talked about the death of Stoney of the King's Own Scottish Borderers. Lucas doesn't make these personal comments very often, and so it must have had a significant impact upon him. And it's intriguing that for Stoney's burial, it was attended by a significant amount of other officers, including senior officers. The 1st Battalion Royal Dublin Fusiliers had suffered probably the worst. The officer group had suffered the worst of any of the 86th Brigade on day 1 of the battle. And there's some great stats which appear in an article about the learning and the development of the Fusiliers and what happened to them. And I'm going to just flick through them really quickly. I'm running out of time, and what I don't want to do is miss the last elements. But what you'll see is just the significance of the percentages there. For the 86th Brigade, there 49% of lost officers lost in that Gully Ravine battle. At V Beach, 67% of the officers, 49 of those who are there still in place for Gully Ravine. And then also the percentage loss, again, at Scimitar Hill of the officers, again, a combined percentage of the 86th Brigade there of 37.8%. But what a difference between September and December in terms of the strength of officers compared with the normal peacetime complement, but also the actual losses that took place over that time as the campaign moved into a different phase. Gallipoli ended careers. Tizard was relieved of his command for his apparent failure to achieve a quicker success at V Beach. He was retired the following year. Some reputations were enhanced. Lucas started the campaign as a captain, and by the end is a temporary brigadier general commanding the 87th Brigade, someone who had shown by his leadership that he'd won the confidence of those around him. For Marshall, goes from being a lieutenant colonel of the Sherwood Foresters in 1914 to being a brigadier general and then a major general of different divisions in 1915, going to Salonika, then as GOC of the 3rd Indian Corps in Mesopotamia, and eventually commander of the Allied forces in Mesopotamia, taking the final surrender of the Ottoman forces. And it's Gary Sheffield who says that these men had an extremely trying apprenticeship on the peninsula, but built upon those experiences later. Marshall manages to get in this painting of, I think it's the 22 most foremost generals at the end of the First World War. He does only get a head and a couple of boots showing in comparison to some of the others, but he is there on that picture. There are also quite extreme individuals like Jack Sherwood Kelly, who manages to go from being essentially a reserve officer to a major in the King's Own Scottish Borderers as he's drafted to Gallipoli. His career was entirely atypical compared to Colonels Coe, Hume and Jones of the 87th Brigade at the start of the campaign. He's referred to in the regimental records as a Herculean giant of South African origin. He did have an extreme disregard for danger, and he just loved giving catapult exhibitions in the trenches in Gallipoli. The 87th Brigade got a reputation for having a good deal of the flavour of the old regulars still hanging around them. This was when Lucas would have been in charge. I can quite believe this. I know a little bit about his family life after the war. Orders given without circumlocution, incessant inspections, constant criticism and fault finding, insistence on the salute, unending fatigues, and no bally politeness. That would have been Lucas all over. So, does anybody get the blame? Does any of the leadership of the 29th get the blame for anything that happens? No, they are not the ones that are named and shamed in the report of the Dardanelles Commission. There is some implication that more could have been done to improve the effectiveness of the attacks through April, May, and June, July. But officers are not named, decisions are not particularly picked out. It is the officers of 9th Corps and the attack at Sula who get the rough end of the Dardanelles Commission. The official history, though, picks out the significance of the fact that so many of the leadership group of the 29th Division were killed or wounded during the first few days, and the impact that that had upon the success of the venture on the Dardanelles. The 29th Division, it said, had put an indelible mark on history, but what it didn't do was seize any initiative that it did manage to secure in those early hours. And there was inertia. And it says perhaps that was the result of the loss of the commander of the covering force and his immediate deputies. Hamilton, of course, does think that they were incomparable. These are the reasons that he says that they are incomparable. His positive comments are sort of drawn in sharp relief when he inspects the 87th Brigade at the end of September 1915 and looks out on men for whom had given their all in the service of the endeavours that he had inspired. Hamilton goes on to say that what happened to the 29th was still running in the veins of those who were their successors in France. And we do know, of course, that the 29th threw themselves at Beaumont Hamel on the 1st of July 1916 with horrendous casualties again. Brigades significantly depleted again. Losses sometimes up to 50% again. If we're to look at morale, what we can see is Gary Sheffield in his recent talks and writings has identified that essentially the 29th Division was temporarily combat ineffective in May, late May and early June after the results of the Carinthia battles. Even General Patton weighs in on it in a study in 1936, where he highlights the heavy losses in commanding officers, the lack of leadership and the inertia. He actually calls Wybeach the most futile and possibly the most disgraceful 31 hours in the history of the British Army, which the Army might want to complain about saying the Navy were there as well, but never mind. That was Patton's perspective. We all know that he was so anti-inertia that he would drive his forces forward wherever possible, especially in the latter part of 1944 and into 1945. Churchill thinks that the 29th, the prolonged, renewed and seemingly inexhaustible efforts of the survivors, their persistency, their willpower, their physical endurance, achieved a feat of arms not often, if ever, surpassed in the history of either island race. Deploying the English language yet again to bolster the reputation of the 29th. Reputation which a friend of mine, David Griffiths, has recently had an article published in Stand 2, the Western Front Association magazine, where what he does is he tries to suggest that perhaps this reputation was cultivated by Hamilton and by Churchill as a way of distracting attention from what went wrong with the campaign. Finally, a few postscripts, and I'm aware that I have gone so way over time that yes, I did bite off far more than I can chew in what I've written here. It's impossible to avoid the scale of loss. The days of the Somme, Arras and Third Ypres lay ahead of the 29th, and the Battle of Loos was happening far away as they attacked in the spring of 1915. Individual battalions had suffered losses in late 1914, which were similar in intensity, but not across the breadth of such a force as the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. If we subscribe to the nation-making sacrificial impact of the Anzac experience, then it is no wonder that the 29th was awarded some sort of badge of honour. Incomparable does probably fit. In the words of A.W. Pollard, they went forth first a little army. All its men was true as steel. The hordes of the enemy were hurled against them. They fell back, but their heart failed not. This is, of course, the consecration of the 29th Division Memorial, church in Eltham. Another little postscript. Petrie of the South Wales Borderers, the staff of the 87th Brigade, was the General Officer commanding 12th Eastern Infantry Division in France in October 1940. It was his Petrie force that was thrown into actions to try and prevent the rapid advance of the German armoured forces in the area around Arras. And lastly, a very poignant photograph for me. This is me escorting CHT Lucas's daughter to lay a wreath at the 29th Division Memorial in March 2015. She is no longer with us, but it was my great honour and privilege for her that day to be able to lay a wreath marking what her father and his peers had contributed to in service of their country. If you want to know anything more about Lucas's service, then you can look at his diary online, both for the Somme and Gallipoli at these two spots. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and I apologise for going over time.
Thank you very much, Steve. And if you can put your hands together, either use the reaction button down the bottom or put into chat your feedback, that would be gratefully appreciated. And also, if you have any questions for Steve, think about those. And again, please use the chat and we can ask Steve in a few minutes. Very thought-provoking. Very good coverage of the 29th Division and their sort of command. It was very much, I think, the vision, the shadow of its former self from those early days in March 1915 in England, when they all came back there around sort of rugby, etc. to what faced them out in Gallipoli in April 1915. How much do you think, just to sort of kick off, Steve, did sort of command and control falter because of the severe rates of casualties amongst those senior officers during the let's say the first day of the landings? Did that impact their performance and reaching their objectives for those first days, or were they always unrealistic?
Well, would Y Beach have been evacuated if Coe had lived? I think is a question that we can ask ourselves. If Hare had not been wounded at W Beach, would he have had a greater impact on what was happening at X Beach in terms of to take advantage of the easier landing there? The fact that the leadership of the assault at V Beach was wiped out, no communication therefore with what was happening with Casson and the South Wales Borderers at S Beach. I think you have to say that command and control fell down. Everybody did their best to the level that they could do. They were well trained and they were professional. They'd worked together. They'd had that command experience. Their training, I think, for officers at that time, the idea was that you were trained almost to take the position of your immediate superior. So that worked. But what you had was not just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 officers in a battalion wounded or killed, you might have 50% of the officers. So what force could survive that level of sacrifice and death is what I would say, without there being some impact. That would have been miraculous if there had been no consequence, Steve.
Yeah, and it sounds like, even during Gallipoli, they were in a way reconstituted as a division time and time again. So by the time they get to the Somme in July 1916, I don't know, has your research shown how many sort of veterans of the first day of the landings were still in the line?
Yes, I found a document in Lucas's material the other day, which listed the men still serving in April 16 who'd been serving in April 15. In each battalion, 3 or 4.
Wow.
Amongst the command group, probably about 25%. So you can see it was. And then again, on the 1st of July, the battalion's battered again. It is again in spring of 1917. I reckon when I did an analysis that Lucas had actually gone through probably 5 times the equivalent of the 87th Brigade in those 2 years, 1915 through to 1917,
Wow.
in terms of losses.
Great, thank you, Steve. Got a few questions coming in now.
Now this is where I get worried.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll be gentle. I've got one from Mark who's raising his hand. Mark, let me unmute you, or if you can unmute yourself. Is there a question you'd like to ask Steve? And maybe not. Maybe come back to Mark. Gerald, you've also raised your hand. I'm not sure if that's to congratulate Steve on his talk. If you wanted to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. Maybe Gerald was just raising his hand.
Maybe their hands are raised in surrender, Steve.
Could be. But I've got some, lots of good feedback coming in. Fascinating, moving talk. Thank you so much. One from Carol Sherwood is, do you know where the medals are and any chance of getting them back? I'm probably referring to Lucas there.
Steve, you and I had a Twitter conversation about this not too long ago. They were originally sold, as I said, about 30 years ago by Lucas's son to fund his double glazing. They were sold down in Somerset. We think they went to the States, and they were actually advertised for sale at an auction in the States. I think probably about a couple of years ago, Steve, if I remember rightly. A very fine group of medals. We still have the miniatures, but we had a discussion amongst the family, and we didn't feel it was appropriate to spend. I think the guide price was around about £8,000, £6,000 to £8,000. So we didn't feel it was appropriate to use family resources for that. We still had what we thought was far more valuable, and that was the diaries and the letters and the photographs. You may or may not have seen my sister-in-law on the Antiques Roadshow about a year ago, sharing the example of Lucas's secret diary and letters that he'd sent home when he was captured by the IRA in 1920. He's the most senior British officer to be captured by the IRA and escape. And she was quite staggered when the 20 letters and secret diary were valued at £5,500. So goodness knows what the value of the hoard is that I have in my study here at home.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things which is basically invaluable, not only to the family, but to people studying, the Great War in general. Is you just can't replicate that. And it's so sad you hear these stories of so many documents like that being thrown away into skips because they think there's no value, and not necessarily sort of monetary value, but historical value is priceless. And Yeah, definitely. Yeah, if you want some double glazing, Steve, in a swap for the diaries, let me know. A question coming from David Lewis. The question is, yeah, surely the inability of the Navy to provide cover should have been realised in the planning stage. Any comment on that?
I think if I remember rightly, there'd been a staff or a War Office investigation as to how successful an invasion of the Dardanelles could be, about 10 years before the First World War. And if I remember rightly, one of the things that had been identified as them was the difficulty of ships supporting land-based troops after the initial landings. So I think everybody told themselves that it would be okay. I think if you could say that's a sort of an endemic problem of what happened with Gallipoli, that almost everybody just crossed everything and went for it. And some things miraculously did come out okay, but that supporting by ships of what was happening on the land didn't, especially when submarines appeared and started sinking ships like the Majestic. There was no way that those significant capital ships were going to stay close enough to be able to give the fire support needed. And it was the development of ships like the Monitor, an example of which is, I think, still down at Portsmouth dockyard. Very shallow, howitzer sort of high trajectory weapons towards the latter part of the campaign, which meant that support would be more available again.
Or just thinking back to that wonderful tongue-in-cheek photograph of Lucas's showing the naval support or lack of naval support off the Aegean or wherever it was. Got another question coming, one from Warren Smith. Do you think Shaw would have done differently had he still been in command rather than Hunter Weston?
That's a good what if. You could write that. I think it would have been different. Whether his brand of leadership could have made the difference in terms of the progress of the division or not. Hunter Weston was definitely a large personality. If you wanted an aggressive general who was not going to hold back, then actually that's what you needed. In some ways, I can't work out how Hunter Weston acted so against type on April the 25th. Inactivity, indecision, lack of troops being driven forward, but then compare it with later on in the campaign with that continual push, even sometimes without those meticulous plans that he's supposed to be responsible for. Lucas actually refers to Shaw as a nice man. Now, I'm not sure whether nice wins the sort of nasty battles that Gallipoli was. Shaw, though, does come out fairly well in his participation in the latter part of the year, but the attacks of April 25th onwards were very different from the campaign in its last 4 months. Yeah, and that's a typical historian's answer. Maybe yes, maybe no.
We love those answers. And I think, Gallipoli, sort of modern warfare, if you just look at the Great War, a lot of those officers hadn't necessarily been trained for that. They were sort of their time. A lot were old and maybe familiar with the Boer War, not necessarily this modern industrial war, as it sort of turned out from 1914 onwards. I think we have a question from Graham Walker. Graham, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Graham.
Hi, Steve. Firstly, I thought it was really excellent, very detailed, very well researched, and the graphics came across brilliantly. I took a few notes about the graphics, and I might use that in the future. I'm researching Billy Unsworth, One or two may know about Billy Unsworth, but Billy's brother, Henry Bowker, which was an alias, he joined the Royal Munster Fusiliers in Manchester in 1904. He was on the River Clyde. He received the and he was also injured. He had a head wound on that day. He went on to join the military provost staff, and I think he did something in Ireland as well, undercover. But who would be the best person, do you think, who could assist me to go a bit deeper and find out about what Billy did and where he did and who he was with during his time at Gallipoli?
His time at Gallipoli. Steve, would you know who the best person about the Munsters would be?
Not the television programme, the
the
first battalion. Yeah.
The Royal Munster Fusiliers, to give them their correct name.
No, a very good question. I'm trying to think of books on the Munsters, and not too many sort of jump to mind. One place you can start are the War Diaries, which are good. I'm trying to think if they have a complete set for the Royal Munster Fusiliers, but that will give you some idea to where they served, what they did in context of Gallipoli from the days they landed through to the evacuation. What rank was he, Graham? Beg your pardon?
He started off as a private. I think when he was at Gallipoli, he was sergeant, and then he became a staff sergeant as he went with the provost staff after Gallipoli. Yeah, so it's probably worth checking. I would say it's unlikely he would be mentioned. Even all the officers are not always mentioned, depending how good the diarist is in the first place. Maybe if I had a military medal or the wound, maybe.
Yes, and the military medal is interesting because that wasn't officially, I think, constituted until later in 1916. But as you probably know, many were backdated for the Gallipoli campaign. They don't always have a citation, but one book to check is the Munsters history of the regiment. I believe it's a 3-volume set. And I believe that has a role in the back of gallantry awards. So that's worth checking out. If you can't get hold of a copy, send me an email. And I think I have one on the shelf at home I could check for you and look his name up.
Farmer, for part of his time on the brigade, the book Cornerstones, he was staff captain of the 86th Brigade, so of whom the Royal Munsters were a part. So there could be the occasional reference to the experience of that battalion, which of course was fused together with the Royal Dublin Fusiliers to become the Dubsters, because of the extent of losses of both of the battalions in the early weeks of the campaign.
He did go with the Dubsters. I kind of found that out. I've got his attestation papers when he signed up, but we don't know why he joined up as in an alias in 1904.
But Lucas actually says that he was offered command of the Royal Munster Fusiliers, but didn't want to touch it with a barge pole, and that was in early May, I think, of 1915. Marshall suggests you might want to go and sort of help them reconstitute themselves, and he says, no way. Don't want to be part of that. So
well, that's great. Thanks.
That's all I know. Thank you.
And just see Steve holding the book Cornerstones. Catherine's book is very good, actually. Especially from that, looking at it from a staff officer's point of view and the chaos, especially of, from the 25th of April, that morning, with all the officer casualties Steve was just talking about, through to later on in the campaign. A very, very good read and a good solid section on Gallipoli. So yeah, if you haven't got it already, and you've got room on your shelf, highly recommend it. Gerald, have you got a question from you? I see you've got your hand up again.
Yes.
I'm not sure. Yep.
Yes. Okay, just to give a small bit of background myself, I am from Tipperary. Well, I'm the token Irishman that's listening in tonight.
Perfect.
And I'm originally from Tipperary. It's a long way up there, but I'm living in Cork. And my home parish in Tipperary, Laura, is the home place of the Stoney family that was mentioned a few times in your book. Many of them served in the Great War, And actually, you mentioned there about the Dohy, Wiley and Walford in the when they took over command in V Beach. Stoney also took over command of the Munster Fusiliers in the advance up the hill there in the village. And he was the only survivor of those two. He was subsequently, he served for Gallipoli. He was killed later on and he's buried in Pink Farm, right? Among the Munster Fusiliers that advanced, they were stopped by a wire fence, and a fellow called William Cosgrove from Cork dismantled the wire fence under fire. He was awarded a VC for that, and he's known as the Irish Giant of Gallipoli. Also, you mentioned General Lucas, and a nice man. During his time, and I would think it's the same person, he was captured down in Cork.
He was, yes.
And he spent his time with his captors playing cards, and he also insisted on being served the best quality whiskey, and had that every night. And it seemed it was quite his captors had to pay for this whiskey out of their own money. So I don't know, not quite sure that he escaped. It seems that he got sort of lost in transit, and I think they were glad to see the end of him because of the expense involved, right?
Yes, there is a variety of opinion. Was he costing them so much in whiskey that they let him escape? I think probably more that they were failing to achieve the political steps forward that they hoped to achieve in terms of exchanging him for an IRA prisoner that was being held. So I think they cut their losses, literally.
I think there was an example of Stockholm syndrome as well.
Yeah. He said, a gentleman looked after by gentlemen, I think was the way you referred to that time.
Yeah, so sometimes being a nice guy helps. And also, and also the last speaker there, Graham Walker, there's actually a Royal Munster Fusiliers Association here in Cork, very active to do a lot of research. And if you're not able to get them on the web, you have my email. You can get my email address from Steve or whatever, and you can make contact with me. And they're very active and do a lot of research and have a lot of knowledge on the various members of the Royal Munster Fusiliers.
Oh, fantastic. That's a really kind offer.
Very, very good speech. Thank you very much. And as I said, I hadn't realised there'd be such a connection between Tipperary and Cork, but there you are, yeah.
Well, I just love the story of the captors have to pay for his whiskey bill. It's
yes,
quite an amazing feat.
They were never compensated for it, but that's over the years. Those things, you know, anecdotes get bigger and bigger. But well, that's the story anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. Right, we're coming up to the top of the hour. We've got a couple of minutes. If anyone's got any more questions, please put that into the chat. Or put your hand up. That would be great, and we can ask Steve those questions. Just double checking the chat, Steve, make sure nothing else I've missed. I think I've answered it all. Lots of good feedback there, so we'll share that with you later. I'm not sure if you can see it from your side. But no, a thoroughly good talk, Steve. Really enjoyed it. I think it's made by those photographs. You know how much I love Gallipoli images, and he was definitely a talented photographer, and you're so lucky having that amazing collection. So, you know, keep it in the family and look after it and treasure it.
I did let you use 3, Steve, for your book with
yes, you did. So thank you again for that. And I'm sure I've given you a signed book. If not, I'll give you another one.
You have done.
And also, yeah, check out Steve's websites as well. I'm thoroughly recommended if you want to know more about Gallipoli or want to know more about Lucas and the 29th Division on the Somme. And I use it fairly regularly, actually, because Lucas is great at mentioning so many individuals, so it's nice to get his sort of view on those people. And one I'm keen to look at again is Godfrey Fawcett from the Essex, who has I've found some interesting information on him, so I'll be interested to find out his view. So we can share that later, maybe over a pint when we can get back together in physical pub.
Got it.
So
Could I jump in, Steve?
Yes, you can indeed. Yes.
If you're still scanning for questions, the next talk, we have our next talk on Tuesday, July the 6th. There isn't a talk in June because Professor Gary Sheffield is doing the talk. That's on morale and combat motivation in 8th Corps at Hellas, and that's on the July the 6th. At the end of July, we've got a talk by Anne Pedley about the Welsh soldiers in Gallipoli. Two very interesting talks coming up. The procedure is I send people flyers on these talks and then ask you to request links on there. Stephen, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Yeah, sorry, it's just the sound in my earphones has gone slightly differently. That's okay. And so the procedure, we don't send links out straight away. We send out flyers and ask you to request links because otherwise we don't know how many people we're actually going to get. There is, I've been told, sister organization, the Western Front Association, has got a conference on the 12th and 13th of June. The 13th of June, there's a section on Gallipoli, if you check out their website there. Okay. So I do have this video to show. It'll be a good way of going out. But Steve, do you want to say anything more? Any more questions? Otherwise, I'll just mention the video. We can play it, and then when it finishes, you just close down. But before we do that, I'd certainly like to thank Steve for a fantastic talk. Really, very, very interesting indeed, and very enjoyable.
Thank you.
Great talk.
Yeah. Okay, so if there are no other questions, Steve, if I share my screen and see if I can get the video working. Right, where's it gone, where's it gone, where's it gone? Just let me see. Hopefully the technology doesn't defeat me.
Oh, we love technology.
Yes, we do, don't we? We do.
Something you can rely upon with technology's failure.
Yeah, yeah. Go back to share. I'm just trying to share the screen. It won't be a moment. There we go. For some reason, I'm not being able to share the screen. Okay, just to mention the video then, I'm not quite sure what the problem is.
Steve, would you like to stop sharing just in case that's conflicting?
I think
I have stopped.
Oh, you have stopped?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, yes, you have.
Yeah.
Beg your pardon.
Yeah. It's just I can't see the file that I want to share, and when I try and share the file, it knocks out Zoom. So I'll just mention about the video because rather than delay people, the video clip we produced. I did some of it. Steve did the quality control. That is a tribute to the 29th Division. And it is on Monday, it was the 100th anniversary of the dedication of the monument in Stretton upon Dunsmore. Partly because of the pandemic, but also because of the dangers of going on the island, even individually, never mind as a group, because of the traffic and the problems with having the road closed, because now road closure dealt with by private companies, and we were quoted £10,000 to have a partial closure of the A45. The video, and Robert is showing the link there. The video is on the Gallipoli Association YouTube channel, and it's a an 8-minute tribute to the 29th Division and some information about the memorial itself. Steve's quite right. There was a Steve Warburton. There was a memorial in 1916. I've mentioned that in the slides in the southeast, and then there's 1921 rather. The very impressive memorial was raised there. So it's on the YouTube channel. So do have a look. Do have a look. And the technology works. Unlike tonight. Okay. Thank you, Steve. That's it for me.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you again, Steve. And yeah, hope to welcome you back soon. So yeah, for those left in the call, last round of applause, Mr. Steve Warburton. Check out his website, buy the book on Cornerstones, and you'll be entertained on all things Gallipoli for a little bit longer. So thank you for tonight. Yeah, join us again for our next talk by Professor Gary Sheffield, and hope to see you all again soon. Good night.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.